An injured seal crawled onto a fisherman's boat, and his next move shocked an entire village. Little did anyone know that this desperate act of survival would change their lives forever. The lone fisherman faced a choice that day, one that would test not just his humanity, but challenge the very soul of their coastal community. With blood staining his deck and storm clouds gathering overhead, he made a decision so unexpected, so profound, that it rippled through generations. What began as a rescue at sea became something no one could have predicted, especially not the hardened villagers who had long forgotten what it meant to care. Marco wasn't just any fisherman. He was the village outcast. For 15 years, he'd kept to himself, his weathered face telling the story of a man who preferred the company of crashing waves to human conversation. The locals whispered about his past. Some said heartbreak, others claimed tragedy. But no one really knew the truth. Every morning before dawn, Marco would push his small boat into the unforgiving sea alone. No crew, no companion, just him against the elements. His calloused hands told the story of 1,000 solo journeys, each one taking him further from human connection. That man's soul is as cold as the North Atlantic, the village elder would say. But beneath Marco's hardened exterior lay a wound that never healed, one that made him believe isolation was his only path forward. What the villagers didn't understand was that Marco's daily ritual wasn't just about catching fish. It was about escaping the memories that haunted him whenever his feet touched solid ground. The sea was his sanctuary, the only place where the weight on his chest lightened enough for him to breathe. But fate has a way of disrupting even the most established routines. That Tuesday morning, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon and the air hung heavy with unusual stillness, Marco felt something different in his bones. The sea wasn't behaving as it should, almost as if it was preparing to deliver something unexpected to his doorstep. What Marco didn't know was that this ordinary fishing day would become the moment that shattered 15 years of carefully constructed solitude in ways he could never have imagined. The storm hit without warning. One moment, Marco was checking his nets under a brooding sky. The next, his small boat was being tossed like driftwood on waves that seemed determined to swallow him whole. Rain lashed against his face as he fought to maintain control, his muscles straining against nature's fury. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the worn wooden tiller, each crash of water against the hull sending shock waves through his aging vessel. Not today, he growled through clenched teeth, tasting salt on his lips. I've weathered worse than you. But even as the words left his mouth, a massive wave crashed over the bow, nearly knocking him off his feet. The sea was particularly vengeful. Today, as if it had a personal score to settle with the solitary fisherman who had dared to challenge its dominance for so many years. That's when he saw it, a dark shape struggling in the churning water. At first, he thought it was debris from another vessel, perhaps a piece of driftwood or a fragment of someone else's misfortune. But then their eyes met across the chaotic expanse of angry sea. A seal, its sleek body marred by a jagged wound that left a trail of crimson in the water. The creature's desperate gaze locked onto Marco's, communicating a primal plea that transcended species. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a consciousness that seemed to recognize Marco not just as another creature, but as a potential savior. "Go away!" Marco shouted over the howling wind, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I can't help you. Save yourself." But the seal persisted, swimming alongside the boat with labored movements, occasionally disappearing beneath the surface only to resurface with increasing desperation. Marco tried to ignore it, focusing instead on his own survival as the storm intensified. He had enough problems without adding a wounded wild animal to the mix. The village would mock him mercilessly if they knew he was even considering such foolishness. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the scene in stark white flashes that burned the image of the struggling animal into Marco's retinas. The seal's movements were becoming more erratic, more desperate. Its wound, likely from a boat propeller or perhaps the bite of a larger predator, gaped open with each strenuous movement, leaving a widening trail of red that dissipated quickly in the churning waters. Then came the moment that would change everything. With what seemed like its last ounce of strength, the injured seal heaved itself halfway onto Marco's boat, its blood staining the weathered wood. It collapsed there, balanced precariously between sea and sanctuary, its fate literally in Marco's hands. Its breathing was labored, each expansion of its chest a visible struggle against pain and exhaustion. The creature's whiskers trembled with each breath, and its eyes, so unnervingly human, never left Marco's face. Marco stood frozen, rain streaming down his face, mingling with the spray of the sea until he could no longer tell which was which. The village code was clear. Wild animals were to be left alone. Interfering with nature's course was considered foolish at best, dangerous at worst. The elders told stories of those who had tried to save injured wildlife, only to be attacked or to watch the creatures die slowly and painfully despite their efforts. Nature knows its own, they would say. When an animal's time comes, that's that. Every instinct built over 15 years of solitude told him to push the creature back into the sea. It wasn't his responsibility. It wasn't his burden to bear. He had deliberately chosen a life without attachments precisely to avoid moments like this. Moments that required compassion, commitment, and care. "This isn't my problem," he muttered, reaching toward the seal with trembling hands. His calloused fingers hovered just inches from the animal's slick fur. One firm push and it would slide back into the depths, taking its pleading eyes and inconvenient suffering with it. No one would ever know. No one would judge his choice. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the animal's eyes reflected his own loneliness, a mirror to the isolation he had chosen but never truly embraced. Or maybe, after years of turning away from connection, some dormant part of his humanity had finally awakened, triggered by this creature's raw vulnerability and trust. The seal made a soft sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh, as if it somehow understood the battle raging within the fisherman's heart. A particularly violent wave rocked the boat, nearly dislodging the animal back into the sea. Without thinking, Marco lunged forward, steadying the creature with hands that had forgotten the sensation of touching another living being. "Damn it all," he whispered, his gruff voice softening despite himself. "You're as stubborn as I am, aren't you?" With a decisiveness that surprised even himself, Marco carefully pulled the seal fully onto his boat. The animal was heavier than expected, its sleek form dense with muscle and blubber, adapted for the cold Atlantic waters. As he settled it onto the deck, Marco noticed the full extent of its injury, a deep gash that ran along its side, exposing flesh that no creature should have to endure. "I don't know the first thing about helping you," Marco admitted aloud, even as his hands reached for the emergency medical kit he kept stowed beneath his seat. It was meant for human injuries. Cuts from fishing hooks, minor gashes from working with nets. Not for treating wounded wildlife. But it was all he had. The storm continued to rage around them, but Marco barely noticed now, his entire focus narrowed to the bleeding creature before him. With surprising gentleness for hands so accustomed to rough work, He began cleaning the wound as best he could, using fresh water from his canteen and strips torn from his spare shirt. The seal remained unnaturally still during this impromptu treatment, occasionally making soft sounds of discomfort, but never attempting to bite or escape. It was almost as if it understood that this human, unlike whatever had caused its injury, meant it no harm. As Marco worked, the weight of what he was doing began to settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about bandaging a wound. This was about making a choice that went against everything the village stood for, their superstitions, their traditions, their unwritten rules about the natural order of things. He was crossing a line from which there would be no easy return. What Marco didn't realize was that saving this seal wouldn't just change his life. It would challenge everything his entire village believed about the relationship between humans and wild animals. It would force them to confront their fears, their prejudices, and their long-held beliefs about their place in the natural world. As the storm began to subside, giving way to an eerie calm, Marco made a decision. He would bring the seal back to his small coastal cottage, a place that had known only solitude for 15 years. He would nurse it back to health, away from the judgmental eyes of the villagers. And then, when it was strong enough, he would release it back to the sea where it belonged. Simple enough, he thought. What he couldn't possibly know was that nothing about this encounter would be simple. The ripples of his decision would extend far beyond himself and this wounded creature, touching lives throughout the village in ways that would redefine their community forever. As he turned his boat toward home, the seal's eyes drifted closed in exhaustion or trust. Marco couldn't be sure which. But for the first time in years, the fisherman felt something stir within his chest. A sense of purpose that transcended his daily struggle for survival. For better or worse, their fates were now intertwined. As Marco's boat approached the small harbor, the late afternoon sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds, casting an almost ethereal glow over the village. The familiar silhouette of clustered cottages and the weathered fishing dock came into view, a sight that usually brought Marco a sense of resigned acceptance. Today, however, it filled him with apprehension. The seal lay covered beneath a tarp, its breathing steady but labored. Marco had managed to clean and bandage the wound as best he could with his limited supplies, but the creature would need more care than he could provide on a rocking boat. The real challenge now was getting his unexpected passenger home without being seen. Most days, no one paid attention to Marco's comings and goings. His status as the village outcast afforded him a certain invisibility that he had come to appreciate. But today, of all days, several figures dotted the harbor. The storm had driven most boats back early, and fishermen were busy securing their vessels and comparing the day's meager catches. "Just my luck," Marco muttered, adjusting his course slightly to approach the least populated section of the dock. His cottage stood apart from the others, perched on a small rise overlooking the harbor, another physical manifestation of his separation from the community. Usually, he cursed the extra walk up the steep path. Today, he was grateful for the isolation. As he maneuvered toward the dock, a familiar voice called out, "Marco, you made it back. Thought the sea might have finally claimed you in that squall." It was old Thomas, the harbor master, whose rheumy eyes missed little despite his advanced age. The ancient mariner had been the only person in the village who still made an effort to speak to Marco. Though whether from pity or genuine goodwill, Marco had never been sure. "Takes more than a bit of wind to keep me down," Marco replied gruffly, focusing intently on tying his boat to the moorings. He positioned himself to block any view of the tarp-covered shape on his deck. Old Thomas hobbled closer, leaning heavily on his gnarled walking stick. "Strange day for fishing," Something in the air doesn't feel right. His gaze drifted to the tarp. What have you got there? Unusual catch? Marco's heart hammered in his chest. Nothing worth mentioning, just some old nets that got tangled in the storm. Thomas's weathered face crinkled in skepticism. Nets, eh? Funny shape for nets. Before Marco could respond, the seal beneath the tarp shifted slightly, causing a visible movement that no bundle of nets could explain. Thomas's eyebrows shot up toward his salt and pepper hairline. Marco Delmar, he said slowly, his voice dropping to a whisper. Tell me you haven't brought a wild animal to shore. The accusation hung in the air between them. In that moment, Marco had a choice: lie further or trust the old man who, despite everything, had never turned his back completely. I need your help, Thomas, Marco admitted, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves against the dock. Just to get it up to my cottage without the others seeing. Thomas glanced around at the other fishermen, then back at the tarp. His expression was unreadable for a long moment before he let out a resigned sigh. 30 years as harbor master, and I've never broken the village code, he muttered. But I suppose there's a first time for everything. He straightened as much as his curved spine would allow. I'll create a distraction. You get whatever's under there up to your place. And Marco. His gaze hardened. Whatever you're doing, be careful. The village council won't take kindly to this if they find out. Before Marco could thank him, Thomas was shuffling away, calling out to the other fishermen about a problem with the eastern moorings that required immediate attention. One by one, the curious men followed him, drawn by the prospect of drama more interesting than their usual evening routines. With the dock momentarily clear, Marco pulled back the tarp. The seal's dark eyes blinked up at him, alert despite its injury. Something about that gaze unnerved him. There was an intelligence there that seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Don't make me regret this, Marco whispered as he carefully gathered the animal into his arms, wincing at the weight. The seal remained surprisingly docile, as if sensing the need for cooperation. The journey up the steep path to his cottage was excruciating. The seal, though not fully grown, was still heavy, and Marco had to stop several times to adjust his grip and catch his breath. By the time he reached his door, his shirt was soaked with a mixture of seawater, sweat, and the seal's blood that had seeped through its makeshift bandages. His cottage, when he finally shouldered his way through the door, looked smaller than ever before. The single room that had always felt more than adequate for one solitary man suddenly seemed cramped and woefully unprepared for its new occupant. The sparse furnishings, a bed, a table with 2 chairs, though he never had visitors, a small stove, and shelves lined with practical necessities, offered no obvious place for a wounded seal. Marco gently laid the creature on the floor near the hearth, where the lingering warmth from that morning's fire still radiated. The seal's eyes followed his movements as he gathered clean cloths, a basin of fresh water, and the few medical supplies he kept on hand. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted aloud, kneeling beside the animal. I've gutted plenty of fish, but never tried to put one back together. The seal made a soft noise that almost sounded like encouragement. Marco shook his head at the absurdity of the thought. The isolation was clearly affecting his mind if he was imagining conversations with a wild animal. As he carefully removed his makeshift bandages to properly clean the wound, Marco became aware of a presence at his window. He looked up to find a child's face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with wonder and mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. It was Eliza, the daughter of the village schoolteacher. a curious girl known for her wandering ways and fascination with the natural world. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Marco froze. Then Eliza's face broke into a smile of pure delight before she disappeared from view. Marco cursed under his breath. Children were the worst secret keepers in any village. "Well," he said to the seal, resuming his careful cleaning of the wound, "it seems our secret won't last long." The cut was deep but clean, and with proper care, might heal without infection. "I'd give us until morning before the entire village is at my door with pitchforks." The seal blinked slowly, as if processing his words. In the fading light of day, with the storm now just a memory on the horizon, Marco felt the full weight of what he had done. He had broken the village's most sacred unwritten rule: never interfere with wild creatures, especially those from the sea. The ocean gave and took as it pleased, the elders always said. Trying to change its decisions was not only foolish, but dangerous. Yet as he finished bandaging the seal's wound and offered it a small piece of fish from his meager stores, which it accepted with surprising gentleness, Marco couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For the first time in 15 years, his cottage didn't feel empty. The silence that had been his only companion for so long was broken by the soft sounds of another living being. As darkness fell completely, Marco built up the fire and settled into his chair, watching the seal's chest rise and fall in sleep. Tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't predict. The village would react with fear, superstition, perhaps even anger. His fragile position as a tolerated outcast might deteriorate into something more dangerous. But for tonight, at least, he wasn't alone. And somehow, that made all the difference. What Marco couldn't possibly know was that the child at his window had already run home, breathlessly telling her mother about the miracle she had witnessed, the village hermit with a seal in his house. By morning, the story would transform into something far more fantastical in the retelling. And the ripples of change that had begun with a desperate animal seeking help would soon become a wave that would wash away the foundations of everything the village thought they knew about the natural world, about Marco, and about themselves. Dawn broke with unusual clarity after the previous day's storm. Golden light spilled through Marco's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the surprising scene within. A grizzled fisherman asleep in a chair, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, while a seal rested on a makeshift bed of blankets near the hearth. Marco woke with a start, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar sound of breathing that wasn't his own. The events of the previous day came rushing back as his eyes fell on the seal. The creature was awake, regarding him with that unnervingly intelligent gaze. Still alive, then, Marco muttered, his voice rough with sleep. That's something, at least. He rose stiffly, his body protesting a night spent in the chair. As he moved to check on the seal's bandages, a sound from outside caught his attention. Voices, multiple ones, approaching his cottage. The murmur grew louder, punctuated by an occasional exclamation or nervous laugh. Marco's stomach tightened. It seemed Eliza's discovery had spread even faster than he'd anticipated. Moving to the window, he peered out to see a small crowd gathering at the bottom of the path leading to his home. At their center stood Eliza herself, gesturing animatedly as she apparently recounted her sighting to an audience that grew by the minute. Among the gathered villagers, Marco recognized several members of the village council, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. Prominent among them was Harlan Blackwood, the most traditional and superstitious of the elders, whose family had lost 3 members to the sea over generations. Harlan's hatred of the ocean's creatures was legendary. He considered them extensions of the sea's malevolence. This couldn't get much worse, Marco said to himself, turning back to the seal. To his surprise, the animal had managed to drag itself closer to him, leaving a small trail of water across the wooden floor. It made a soft sound, almost like a question. A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. "Marco Delmar." The voice belonged to Harlan. "Open this door immediately. The council demands to speak with you about this abomination you've brought among us." Marco hesitated, looking between the door and the seal. There was no back exit from the cottage, no place to hide his unexpected guest. Confrontation was inevitable. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the seal, feeling ridiculous even as he said it. To his astonishment, the animal lowered its head, as if in understanding. Marco opened the door just enough to block the view inside. "What do you want, Harlan?" The elder's face was flushed with righteous indignation. Behind him stood 4 other council members and at least 20 villagers, their expressions a mixture of fear, curiosity, and judgment. "You know very well why we're here," Harlan said. "Eliza Thornton claims you've brought a creature of the deep into your home. A seal. Have you lost your mind, man? Do you not remember the covenant?" The covenant was what the villagers called their unwritten agreement with the sea. Respect its power, accept its decisions, and never interfere with its creatures. In return, the sea would provide fish and allow safe passage for those who followed the rules. It was superstition dressed as tradition, but it had governed village life for generations. "The animal was injured," Marco said simply. "I couldn't leave it to die." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Admitting to the rescue was apparently more shocking than they had expected. "You had no right." Harlan's voice rose. "That creature was marked by the sea. Its fate was decided." "By a boat propeller, more likely," Marco countered, his patience wearing thin. "Look, I'll heal it and release it. No harm done?" "No harm." Harlan laughed bitterly. "Already the winds have shifted. Thomas says the barometer is falling again. Another storm comes and it's your doing. The sea demands balance." Marco might have dismissed this as mere superstition, if not for the murmurs of agreement from the crowd. They truly believed his actions could bring misfortune to the entire village. "I want to see it," came a clear voice from the back of the crowd. The villagers parted to reveal Helena Thornton, Eliza's mother and the village schoolteacher. Unlike the others, her face showed neither fear nor anger, only curiosity. "If Marco has indeed saved a seal, I'd like to examine it, for educational purposes." Helena was something of an anomaly in the village, educated in the city before returning to her hometown to teach. She was respected for her knowledge, but viewed with mild suspicion for her progressive ideas. "This isn't a classroom exhibition," Harlan protested. "It's a violation of our ways." "Our ways include learning and understanding," Helena countered calmly. "If you're so certain this animal brings danger, shouldn't we at least document what we're dealing with?" Her logic was difficult to refute, especially in front of the gathered crowd. Harlan's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he gestured impatiently toward the door. "Fine. We'll all see this abomination. Then we'll decide what must be done." Marco knew he had little choice. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, allowing the council members to enter his home. Helena followed, with Eliza slipping in behind her mother, despite attempts to keep the children away. The rest of the villagers crowded around the windows, pressing their faces against the glass. The seal, surprisingly, remained calm as the strangers entered. It raised its head, those intelligent eyes taking in each newcomer with apparent assessment. "God preserve us," one of the elders whispered, making a protective sign with his fingers. Helena approached slowly, kneeling at a respectful distance from the animal. "It's a female," she noted after a moment's observation. "Young adult, I'd say. Northern species." She turned to Marco. "May I see the wound?" Marco nodded, kneeling beside her to carefully lift the edge of the bandage. The gash was still angry and red, but showed no signs of infection. "Clean cut," Helena murmured. "Definitely man-made. Propeller injury, as you suggested." She glanced at Marco with something like approval. "Your treatment is surprisingly good." "Just cleaned it and bandaged it," Marco said, uncomfortable with the praise. Eliza had edged closer, her eyes wide with wonder. "Does she have a name?" she asked. Before Marco could answer that, of course the wild animal didn't have a name. The seal made a soft barking sound, almost as if responding to the girl's question. Eliza giggled. "I think she likes me." "It's a wild animal, not a pet," Harlan snapped, keeping his distance from the seal. "And it doesn't belong here. Marco, the council will convene immediately to decide what's to be done. Until then, keep that creature contained." His gaze swept the small cottage with distaste. "Though I don't see how you could possibly keep it properly. It belongs in the sea." "In her condition, returning her to the sea would be a death sentence," Helena said firmly. "The wound needs time to heal." "Perhaps that's what the sea intended," Harlan replied coldly. The tension in the room was palpable as Helena and Harlan faced off, representing two fundamentally different worldviews that had long existed in uneasy balance within the village. "I'll stay to help," Helena announced suddenly, turning to Marco. "The seal will need proper care, and I have some knowledge of animal medicine from my university days." Marco blinked in surprise. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do," she cut him off quietly. "And not just for the seal's sake." He understood her meaning immediately. Having a respected villager involved would provide some protection against the more extreme elements of the council. "This is highly irregular," Harlan protested. "So is a wounded seal seeking human help," Helena countered. "Perhaps, instead of fearing what we don't understand, we should try to learn from it." Harlan's face darkened, but he seemed to recognize he was outnumbered for the moment. "The council meets at noon," he said stiffly. "I expect both of you to be present." With a final glare at the seal, he turned and left, the other council members following reluctantly behind. As the door closed, leaving just Marco, Helena, Eliza, and the seal, an awkward silence fell. Marco had not had visitors in his home for years, let alone a woman and child. He wasn't sure what the proper protocol was. "Well," Helena said practically, breaking the tension, "we should change those bandages properly. Eliza, fetch my bag from outside. I brought some supplies just in case." As Eliza darted out, Helena turned to Marco with a serious expression. "You've stirred up something significant, you know. This isn't just about a seal." "I just did what needed doing," Marco said uncomfortably. Helena studied him with surprising intensity. "That's what makes it so remarkable. After 15 years of doing everything possible to avoid connection, you risked everything to save another creature." A small smile touched her lips. "People are going to wonder why." Marco had no answer for that. He wasn't entirely sure himself why he'd made the choice he had. The seal made another soft noise, drawing their attention. In the morning light, there was something almost otherworldly about the creature. a presence that seemed to fill the small cottage with an energy that hadn't been there before. "There's something unusual about her," Helena murmured, echoing Marco's thoughts. "The way she watches us, it's almost as if—" She was interrupted by Eliza's return, the girl struggling with a heavy leather bag. "I brought everything, Mother. Can I help with the bandages, please?" As they set about properly treating the seal's wound, with Eliza chattering excitedly and Helena providing calm instruction, Marco found himself in the strange position of host to this impromptu medical team. His solitary routine had been completely upended in less than a day. What none of them noticed, in their focus on the seal, was the small crowd that remained outside, watching through the windows. Among them, old Thomas observed with knowing eyes that had seen many strange things in his long life at sea. And as he watched Marco awkwardly offering tea to Helena, while Eliza gently stroked the seal's head, the old harbor master smiled to himself. "About time," he murmured. "About time indeed." Back inside, as the morning light strengthened, the seal's dark eyes caught the sunbeam and, for the briefest moment, seemed to reflect something impossible, a flash of human-like awareness that went beyond animal intelligence. Had anyone been looking directly at her in that instant, they might have questioned everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between species. But the moment passed, quick as a ripple on water, leaving only a wounded seal being tended by unlikely allies, and a village on the brink of transformation that none of them could yet imagine. The village meeting hall had not been this full in years. Wooden benches that usually sat half-empty during council gatherings now groaned under the weight of nearly every adult resident. The air was thick with the scent of too many bodies in too small a space, mingled with the ever-present salt tang that permeated everything in the coastal community. Marco sat uncomfortably in the front row, acutely aware of the stares boring into his back. Helena sat beside him, her posture straight and confident, a marked contrast to his hunched shoulders. They had left Eliza at Marco's cottage, tasked with monitoring the seal, a responsibility the girl had accepted with solemn importance. The meeting hall itself was one of the oldest structures in the village, built from the timbers of a merchant vessel that had run aground nearly 2 centuries ago. Its walls were adorned with faded paintings of legendary catches and weathered figureheads salvaged from shipwrecks. Nets hung from the rafters, not for decoration, but for mending during long winter meetings. The building seemed to breathe with the collective history of the village, its wooden floors worn smooth by generations of feet. At precisely noon, the 7 members of the village council filed in and took their seats at the raised table. Harlan Blackwood, as senior elder, sat center, his weathered face set in grim lines. His hands, spotted with age but still strong, rested on a leather-bound ledger that contained records of village decisions dating back decades. To his right was Agnes Winters, the oldest woman in the village, whose knowledge of herbs and healing had made her the closest thing they had to a doctor before Helena's return. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes remained sharp and observant beneath heavy lids. To his left sat Thomas, whose position as harbor master automatically granted him council membership. Unlike the others, he seemed uncomfortable with the formality, tugging occasionally at the collar of the clean shirt he wore only for official functions. The remaining seats were filled by Morris Fletcher, the shipwright whose family had built vessels for the village for 5 generations. Sarah Holloway, the merchant whose connections to the mainland ensured vital supplies reached them even in the harshest winters. Daniel Reed, a net maker whose intricate designs were said to increase catches by 1/3. And finally, Reverend Collins, who served as both religious leader and keeper of the village records. They were a practical collection of trades that had governed village affairs adequately for generations. They were conservative by nature, resistant to change, but generally fair in their judgments. Today, however, the tension in the room suggested that fairness might be in short supply. Harlan struck a small brass bell to bring the murmuring crowd to silence. The sound rang clear and sharp, echoing against the wooden walls. "We gathered to address a serious breach of village tradition." He began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Marco Delmar has brought a creature of the sea into our community. A living seal that by all natural and traditional laws should have been left to the ocean's judgment." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, like waves against the shore. From the back, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Always knew that Delmar was trouble. Been odd since the accident." Marco stiffened but kept his gaze forward. "Such an action has not been taken in living memory," Harlan continued, his fingers drumming lightly on the ledger before him. "And for good reason. The covenant between our people and the sea is clear. We take only what is freely given in the form of fish for our tables. We do not interfere with the sea's decisions regarding its creatures." Agnes nodded solemnly, the motion causing the amber pendant at her throat, said to protect against the sea's wrath, to catch the light. "The last time such interference occurred was during my grandmother's time. A fisherman attempted to save a stranded whale calf. 3 boats were lost in the storm that followed, with 12 souls claimed by the angry sea." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "My own grandfather was among them. The village nearly died that winter, with so many providers taken." More murmurs, darker now, with fearful glances toward the windows where gray clouds had begun to gather again. A young mother pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, while several fishermen made subtle protective gestures, touching the small talismans many carried. "That's a coincidence, not causation," Helena said clearly, rising to her feet. The rustle of her mainland-style dress seemed almost provocatively modern in the traditional space. "With respect to our traditions, we cannot base decisions on superstition rather than fact. Storms happen. Boats are lost. It's the reality of coastal life, not supernatural retribution." Her words caused several gasps. Even those who might privately agree would rarely speak so boldly against established beliefs. "Fact?" Harlan's eyebrows rose, the bushy white arches nearly touching his hairline. "Is it not a fact that the barometer has been falling since Marco brought that creature ashore? Is it not a fact that unusual currents were reported this morning by the early boats? Currents that nearly capsized the Merriweather brothers?" At this revelation, several heads turned toward the brothers in question, who sat uncomfortably in the middle rows. The younger one nodded reluctantly, confirming Harlan's claim. "Correlation is not causation," Helena countered, using terms that caused several villagers to exchange confused glances. The storm system was already moving in before Marco rescued the seal. As for currents, they change constantly with tides, temperature, and distant storms we cannot even see. The Merriweather's boat might have capsized any day in any season. Sarah Holloway, the merchant, leaned forward. "Helena speaks true about the weather patterns. My contacts on the mainland warned of this system 3 days ago. It's why I delayed the supply shipment." This practical consideration seemed to resonate with some in the crowd. Thomas cleared his throat, the sound rough from years of shouting over wind and waves. "She has a point, Harlan. The weather glass was dropping before Marco's boat returned. I noted it in the harbor log, as I always do." He tapped his temple. "Memory's not what it was, so I write everything down now." Harlan's face darkened at this betrayal from a fellow council member. His fingers ceased their drumming and instead flattened against the ledger. The issue is not just about weather, Thomas. It's about the natural order. What gives Marco the right to decide which creatures live or die? Today a seal, tomorrow what? Will he start building an ark to save every fish in the sea? A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. Even Marco's lips twitched slightly at the absurd image. "I'm not trying to play God," Marco said, standing slowly. The floorboard beneath him creaked in protest, as if even the building objected to his defense. He was unaccustomed to speaking publicly, and his voice came out rougher than intended. The seal was injured by human hands. A boat propeller cut her. Seems to me that makes it a human responsibility to help if possible. He paused, gathering his thoughts. My father taught me that we have a duty to fix what we break. If our boats wounded this creature, doesn't that principle apply? This perspective clearly hadn't occurred to many in the room, judging by the thoughtful expressions that suddenly appeared on several faces. Marco's mention of his father, a well-respected fisherman before his death, carried weight with the older generation. Furthermore, Helena added, seizing the moment, this provides an unprecedented opportunity for education. Our children have never had the chance to observe such a creature up close. There is much we could learn about marine life, about healing, about the very animals that share our waters. Knowledge that could benefit future generations of fishermen. Learn? Harlan scoffed, though something in his expression suggested Helena's argument had found a vulnerable point. What could we possibly need to learn about seals that generations of fishermen haven't already observed? We know their habits, their feeding grounds. We know to keep our distance. But do we understand their anatomy, their healing processes, their intelligence? Helena pressed. The mainland universities would pay handsomely for such observations. It could bring new income to the village. The mention of potential profit caused several heads to turn. Sarah Holloway nodded thoughtfully, always alert to new commercial opportunities. Perhaps how they heal, Agnes said unexpectedly, her voice cracking slightly with age, but still commanding attention. All eyes turned to her, in surprise. The old woman rarely contradicted Harlan. I confess some curiosity about the creature's recovery process. Such knowledge might prove useful. She fingered her amber pendant absently. In my years of healing, I've often wished for better understanding of how different bodies mend themselves. Nature has wisdom we've barely touched. Harlan looked betrayed for the second time. Agnes, surely you of all people understand the risks. I understand tradition, yes, she interrupted gently. But I also understand that knowledge is never a waste. My grandmother may have blamed the lost boats on the rescued whale, but she also told me the fishermen learned valuable techniques for treating wounds that later saved human lives. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, but still penetrating, fixed on Harlan. Including your grandfather's, if I recall the story correctly. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. This piece of village history was not widely known, judging by the reactions. Harlan's jaw tightened, but he didn't contradict her. The council chamber buzzed with conversation as this new perspective rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had arrived united in opposition to Marco's action now found themselves debating its merits. Marco glanced at Helena, who offered him a small, encouraging nod. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "What about the creature itself? Is it dangerous? Could it harm the children?" It was Peter Simmons, father of 3 young boys, and always concerned with practical matters. Before Marco could respond, Daniel Reed, the net maker, spoke up from his council seat. I saw it this morning when I delivered new rope to Thomas. Seemed docile enough. More afraid of us than we of it, I'd wager. It's a female seal, not fully grown, Helena added. She's injured and weak. The only danger she presents is to fish, and she's certainly in no condition to hunt currently. There is another matter to consider, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the chatter. He shifted in his seat, the wood creaking beneath him. The seal sought help. Marco didn't simply find a dying animal and take it aboard. By his account, and I saw the approach myself, the creature actively approached his boat and made efforts to board. In all my years at sea, I've never witnessed such behavior. This revelation caused another stir. Animals seeking human help violated the understood boundaries between man and nature. It suggested a level of intention that many found unsettling. All the more reason to be wary, Harlan insisted, leaning forward. Unnatural behavior suggests unnatural forces at work. What if this is not merely a seal, but something else? Our legends speak of creatures that take seal form. Selkies are children's tales, Helena interrupted, though a few of the older villagers made protective gestures at the mere mention. What we're discussing is a wounded animal with enough intelligence to seek assistance. Nothing more. You mainland types are always so quick to dismiss what you don't understand, muttered an elderly fisherman from the middle rows. The sea keeps secrets you've never dreamed of in your books and universities. The debate continued in this vein for nearly an hour, swinging between traditional fears and more rational perspectives. The room grew warmer as the afternoon progressed, the air increasingly close. Outside, the clouds continued to gather, occasionally blocking the sun and casting the meeting hall into momentary shadow that seemed to emphasize particularly dramatic statements. Throughout, Marco remained largely silent, speaking only when directly questioned. This wasn't his arena. He had spent too many years avoiding village politics to suddenly become comfortable in its midst. He noticed, however, that the tide of opinion seemed to be shifting. For every fearful objection, there came a practical counterpoint. For every superstitious warning, a reasonable explanation was offered. What surprised him most was realizing how many villagers were willing to consider new perspectives. Years of isolation had led him to view his neighbors as a monolithic block of tradition and suspicion. The reality, he was discovering, was more nuanced. Finally, Harlan raised his hand for silence, his signet ring catching the light. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to the head of the council. We must come to a decision, he announced, his tone suggesting he had reached one himself, though perhaps reluctantly. The traditional response would be to return the creature to the sea immediately, allowing nature to take its course. Several heads nodded in agreement, particularly among the older residents. However, he continued, the word hanging in the air for a moment as he seemed to wrestle with what would follow. Given the unusual circumstances and the educational opportunity presented, I propose a compromise. The room fell silent in surprise. Harlan Blackwood was not known for compromising. Even his fellow council members looked taken aback. Marco may continue to care for the seal until it has healed sufficiently to survive on its own. During this time, Helena may conduct whatever educational activities she deems appropriate, provided they do not disrupt village life. However, his voice hardened, finger jabbing the air for emphasis. This is to be considered an exception, not a precedent. and Marco bears full responsibility for any consequences that may arise. By consequences, everyone understood he meant both practical problems and any perceived supernatural retribution from the sea. Additionally, Harlan continued, opening the ledger before him and picking up a pen, preparing to record the decision. The situation will be reassessed in 1 week's time. If the creature shows no improvement, or if any significant misfortune befalls our community, the Council reserves the right to revise this decision. It was as fair as they were likely to get, Marco realized. He nodded his acceptance, aware that he was committing himself to a week of scrutiny and judgment from the entire village. Every mishap, from a torn net to a stubbed toe, would potentially be blamed on his rescue. All in favor? Harlan asked the council, looking to each member in turn. To Marco's surprise, all 7 hands rose, though some more reluctantly than others. Agnes's arthritic fingers trembled slightly as they lifted, while Thomas's hand shot up with confident certainty. "Then it is decided," Harlan declared, striking his bell once more. The sound seemed to release a collective breath the room had been holding. "This council is adjourned. The decision will be recorded as follows. On this day, by unanimous consent, temporary exception granted to Marco Delmar regarding harbor seal rehabilitation, subject to review in 7 days hence." As the crowd began to disperse, many casting curious or suspicious glances toward Marco. Some even approached with questions or offers of assistance. Mrs. Fletcher, the shipwright's wife, mentioned she had scraps of fish that might be suitable for the seal. Young Timothy Hale asked if he might be permitted to sketch the animal for his studies. Even Peter Simmons grudgingly offered the use of his cart if transportation became necessary. Helena touched Marco's arm lightly as they prepared to leave, her fingers warm against his weather-roughened skin. "A victory," she said quietly, her eyes bright with something that might have been excitement or concern, though perhaps a temporary one. Harlan yielded more easily than I expected. Marco wasn't so sure this constituted winning. "He's expecting something to go wrong," he murmured, nodding acknowledgments to villagers as they passed. "They all are. They want it to in a way. It would validate their beliefs." Helena's expression grew thoughtful, a slight crease appearing between her brows. "Then we'll just have to prove them wrong, won't we? Come, we should check on Eliza and your patient. I'm not entirely comfortable leaving a child alone with a wild animal, no matter how docile it seemed." As they left the meeting hall, the gathering clouds overhead finally released their burden, sending villagers scurrying for shelter from the sudden downpour. The rain came not in a gradual buildup, but all at once, as if someone had upended a giant bucket over the village. Marco couldn't help noticing the meaningful glances exchanged as the rain began. For many, this would be the first sign that Harlan's warnings had merit. They hurried up the path to Marco's cottage, the rain plastering their clothes to their bodies. The steep incline became slippery with mud, causing Helena to stumble once. Marco instinctively caught her elbow, steadying her before quickly releasing his grip, uncomfortable with the casual contact. By the time they reached the door, they were thoroughly soaked, water streaming from their hair and clothes to form puddles at their feet. Marco's cottage, perched on its solitary rise, seemed different somehow as they approached. More alive, perhaps. A warm glow emanated from the windows, despite the gray afternoon light, and smoke curled from the chimney in a cheerful spiral that defied the downpour. "Eliza?" Helena called as they entered, pushing wet hair from her face. "How is—" She stopped abruptly, causing Marco to bump into her from behind. Following her frozen gaze, Marco felt his own body go rigid with shock. his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The blankets where they had left the injured seal lay empty, the bandages discarded in a neat pile beside them. Instead, sitting beside the hearth, wrapped in one of Marco's spare blankets, was a young woman with dark, intense eyes that were unmistakably familiar. Her hair fell in wet, black waves around a face that combined delicate features with an almost otherworldly quality. A angry red wound, identical in placement and shape to the seal's injury, was visible on her exposed shoulder. Eliza sat cross-legged before her, apparently in the middle of an animated conversation, her hands gesturing enthusiastically as the stranger listened with patient attention. A half-eaten plate of bread and dried fish sat between them, along with a steaming mug that filled the room with the scent of Helena's herbal tea. Both turned at the intrusion, the woman's expression showing alarm while Eliza beamed with excitement. The stranger clutched Marco's blanket tighter around herself, revealing a flash of what appeared to be a glossy dark pelt folded beside her. "Mother, Marco!" the girl exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "You won't believe what happened. The seal turned into a lady. She says she's a Selkie and her name is Moira, and she comes from the Northern Islands. And she can change between human and seal whenever she wants, except when her sealskin is damaged." The woman, Moira, finished quietly, her voice carrying a musical lilt that seemed to contain the rhythm of waves within it. "Which is why I sought your help, Fisherman." Her dark eyes met Marco's with the same intelligence he had recognized in the seal. "I had nowhere else to turn." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the soft crackling of the fire. Marco felt the room sway slightly around him as everything he thought he understood about the world shifted irrevocably. Helena's hand gripped his arm. Whether to steady him or herself, he wasn't sure. Eliza, oblivious to the adult's shock, continued excitedly. "She showed me how her skin works. It's magic, but also not magic. She says it's just how her people are made. And she knows all about the deep parts of the ocean where humans can't go, and about the songs that whales sing and—" "Eliza," Helena said faintly, finding her voice at last. "Perhaps you could fetch some more tea?" The girl looked disappointed at being interrupted, but nodded and took the kettle to fill it from the water barrel in the corner, giving the adults a moment of relative privacy. "You're real," Marco said, the words sounding foolish even as they left his mouth. "The stories are real." Moira inclined her head slightly. "As real as you are, though perhaps not quite as numerous these days." Her gaze moved between Marco and Helena, assessing their reactions. "I apologize for the deception, but I needed to be certain of your intentions before revealing myself. My kind have learned caution around humans." "With good reason," Helena murmured, her academic mind visibly struggling to reconcile folklore with the evidence before her eyes. The legends about Selkies usually involve their skins being stolen, forcing them to remain human. A shadow crossed Moira's face. "Not all legends are without foundation, but that is not my concern at present." She gestured to her wounded shoulder. "The damage to my skin prevents transformation. Until it heals, I am bound to this form and vulnerable." Marco found himself moving forward, drawn by some impulse he couldn't name. He knelt before the hearth, close enough to see the flecks of gold in Moira's dark eyes, eyes that had watched him from a seal's face just hours before. "Why did you come to me?" he asked quietly. "Of all the boats in the harbor, why mine?" Moira's gaze held his, unwavering. "Because you bear the mark of the sea's touch," she said simply. "I can sense it on you, the one who nearly drowned but was returned." The sea rarely gives back what it takes. Such people carry a connection. Marco's hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where beneath his shirt lay the jagged scar from the accident 15 years ago. The day that had claimed his family and nearly his own life. He had never spoken of the strange visions he'd experienced while underwater, of voices that seemed to debate his fate before he was suddenly thrust back to the surface. "Well," Helena said finally, her voice stronger now, though still tinged with awe. "It seems our educational opportunity just became considerably more significant." She smoothed her wet skirts in a gesture that seemed to help her regain composure. "And I believe Harlan Blackwood would have a complete apoplexy if he knew what actually sits in Marco's cottage." Despite the gravity of the situation, Marco felt an unexpected laugh escape him at the image of the elder's reaction. Even Moira's lips curved in a slight smile. "Indeed," the Selkie agreed. "Which is why discretion would be wise, at least until my skin has healed enough for me to leave. I have no wish to bring trouble to those who helped me." Eliza returned with the filled kettle, hanging it over the fire. "Are we keeping Moira a secret?" she asked, having clearly overheard. "Like a special mission?" Helena knelt beside her daughter, taking the girl's hands in her own. "Eliza, this is very important. No one can know about Moira's true nature. Not your friends, not your teachers, not anyone in the village. Do you understand?" The girl nodded solemnly, though her eyes shone with the excitement of being included in something so extraordinary. "I promise. But..." Her brow furrowed. "What do we tell people who ask about the seal?" It was a practical question that highlighted the complexity of their situation. Marco glanced at Helena, who looked equally uncertain. "We tell a version of the truth," Moira suggested. "That the seal is recovering in private, away from curious eyes that might cause it stress. That is not uncommon for wild creatures, is it not?" "A reasonable explanation," Helena agreed. "Though we'll need to be careful about who visits. Questions will be asked." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. A flash of lightning illuminated the cottage briefly, followed seconds later by a rumble of thunder that seemed to emphasize the gravity of their situation. Marco moved to the window, watching sheets of water cascade down the glass. The village below was barely visible through the downpour, just a collection of smudged lights in the premature dusk created by the storm. He thought of Harlan's warnings and the villagers' superstitions, wondering if perhaps they contained more truth than he had been willing to acknowledge. The storm had arrived in more ways than one, and Marco had the distinct feeling that the village's covenant with the sea was about to be tested in ways none of them could possibly have anticipated. Behind him, the soft voices of Helena, Eliza, and a creature of legend continued their conversation, as ordinary as a tea party, and as extraordinary as the tides that had brought them together. In that moment, Marco realized that his solitary existence had been irrevocably breached. For better or worse, his cottage was no longer a place of isolation, but the center of something transformative. Not just for himself, but potentially for the entire village and its relationship with the sea that both sustained and threatened it. The rain continued to fall, and within its rhythm, Marco could almost hear the ocean's voice, neither threatening nor comforting, but watching and waiting to see what would unfold. The storm raged through the night, battering Marco's cottage while an unexpected domesticity settled inside. Helena and Eliza remained rather than risking the treacherous path down to the village, with Marco giving them his bed while he slept by the fire. Moira, still wrapped in a blanket and guarding her damaged seal skin, rested on cushions near the hearth. As midnight approached, Helena continued her careful questioning about Selkie life. Moira revealed her people numbered perhaps 100 families scattered across the northern archipelagos, gathering during migrations to share news and celebrate. She explained she'd been following herring shoals with her cousin Kier when they were separated in a storm, and she was injured by a boat propeller while searching for him. When asked about her sealskin, Moira explained it needed to heal for her to transform again, preferably with moisture. Marco and Helena proposed creating a saltwater bath to help the healing process, which Moira confirmed would be beneficial. Later, when Helena retired to bed, Moira confronted Marco about his near-drowning experience years ago. "You were taken deep, weren't you? And then given back." She explained that the deep ones had marked him, creating a resonance she could sense in her distress. Though Marco resisted these mystical implications, Moira gently suggested that if Selkies could exist unknown to science, perhaps other wonders might also be real. By morning, the storm had passed. Over breakfast, they made plans. Helena and Eliza would return to the village to gather information and supplies, while Marco would stay with Moira and establish a proper saltwater bath for her sealskin. After they departed, Marco and Moira created a treatment area using a large wooden tub filled with seawater and additional salt. As Moira tended her skin, she shared details about her people's ancestral homes in caverns beneath northern islands, with walls marked by generations of history. Their conversation was interrupted by Harlan and Agnes arriving to check on the seal, concerned about storm damage in the harbor. Before Marco could find a solution to this predicament, Thomas the harbor master burst in with alarming news. The Merriweather brothers' boat had returned empty, with blood on the deck and nets torn apart by something with powerful teeth. Harlan immediately blamed Marco's interference with the natural order, declaring, "The sea demands balance for your interference," before hurrying to organize a search party. When they were alone again, Moira asked Marco if he still believed there was no supernatural connection. Though uncertain, Marco focused on the immediate concern. "2 men are missing, and the village will be looking for someone to blame. We need to be very careful." Moira responded solemnly, "The boundary between your world and the sea has been disturbed, Marco Del Mar. What happens next may depend on more than just human actions."